If you're looking to buy a NAS, there's a world of options out there. On one end of the spectrum, you can go with DIY. With this option, you have tons of flexibility when it comes to hardware and software options, but you do have to roll up your sleeves and do all the dirty work, researching components, putting everything together, and then troubleshooting when things go wrong.
Oh my god.
On the other end of the spectrum, well, you pretty much have Synology, where the software is rock solid and feature-rich, but the hardware, well, you just end up paying a ton for the features you need, if they even exist. For example, do you want a 4-bay NAS with a modern CPU that can support hardware transcoding for Jellyfin or Plex? Well, too bad. But what if there's a Goldilocks solution that's just right? Something that offers more modern features and performance, while also providing a turnkey solution that works right out of the box. Oh, and of course can also run something like Proxmox or TrueNAS. Well, maybe, just maybe, that's what this is. So let's check it out. This is the F4-424 Max from TerraMaster, and it might look familiar because, well, it looks pretty much identical to all of their other NAS and DAS products. But this NAS packs a serious punch, and I thought it might be worth checking out. And I'm not just going to be checking out the hardware, I also want to test out the software that comes with this little guy. I haven't taken a look at TerraMaster's TOS software in years, and with the release of TOS6, it looks like there might be a good amount of improvement. Maybe even to the point where I wouldn't just suggest installing Proxmox or TrueNAS or whatever other third-party operating system of your choice. Now, speaking of software, if you run a business or work in IT, you know just how tricky it can be finding the right software fit for your organization. Fortunately, there's Odoo, the sponsor of today's video. Odoo is an open-source ERP software suite offering over 45 user-friendly applications, making it an excellent choice even for large enterprises. Its modular design, however, means that if you're running a small business, you can begin with just the core tools you need and scale up as your business expands. Whether it's CRM, inventory management, accounting, or project management, Odoo provides a unified and seamless system. There's even a website builder that allows you to easily create and customize your site. Odoo stands out thanks to its affordability and flexibility. You can self-host the Community Edition for free, or opt in for the Enterprise Edition, which provides additional features and support at a great value. Plus, you can start with one app for free for life, so if you only need that one app, you don't have to pay for anything. Also, with a large community of developers and users, finding resources and advice is easy. So if you're looking to streamline operations or support the growth of your business, Odoo is definitely worth considering. If you're interested, you can use my link down in the description to start your 15-day trial and get your first app for free. Now really quick, I do want to make it clear that TerraMaster did send this NAS over to me so I could check it out. However, they didn't pay me or ask me to say anything specific. So I get to say whatever I want about this, and trust me, I will. Even if it means TerraMaster never wants to send me a product again. Honestly, after some of the previous videos I made on their products, I'm a little bit surprised that they did. Maybe that's just because they feel so confident with their new software, as well as this hardware. And speaking of this hardware, let's check out the F4-424 Max. As I said, the case looks like most of their other recent products, with a pretty simple design made of mostly light plastic. On the front there are just the 4 3.5-inch or 2.5-inch drive bays, and some indicator LEDs. And that's it. No power button or USB ports. And I do have to say this was a bit annoying once I got into testing, having to reach back around to hit the power button or to plug in any flash drives. And it's also a bit odd to not have a USB port on the front, considering they sort of tout a USB backup feature, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Moving to the back of the case, at the top there's the power button, followed by an HDMI port, 2 10GB RJ45 Ethernet ports, 3 10GB USB ports, with 2 being Type A and 1 Type C, and then the DC power jack. The 424 Max is powered by an Intel i5-1235U, which has 2 P cores and 8 E cores for a total of 12 threads. Now the 12th gen 1235U is getting a bit old at this point, but it's still relatively new in comparison to other NAS models that are on the market, and it should have plenty of horsepower for whatever you might want to do with this system. The 424 Max only comes with 8GB of DDR5, but can easily be expanded up to 64GB officially. However, it does seem like Wendell over at Level 1 Techs had no issues dropping in 96GB. There's also 2 Gen 4x4 NVMe sockets, and well, that's basically it. It's a pretty simple little box, but man, 10GB NICs, Gen 4x4 NVMe SSDs, a 12th gen i5 with DDR5, as long as this comes in at a pretty reasonable price, oh yeah, that's right. It comes in at a pretty steep $900. At that price, is this thing even worth it? Well, there's only one way to find out. To start things off, I dropped in some 5400 RPM 4TB Western Digital drives. And the trays for those drives are pretty similar to Synology, where they have these little rails that snap the drives into place. It's not the best, but it definitely got the job done. Now, if you've watched my channel in the past, you know I typically like to stick with third-party software, but I figured with a NAS like this, it was probably more responsible to start off with the first-party operating system before trying to get into the BIOS or installing Proxmox or something. I'm just kidding. After plugging it in, I spammed some F keys and the delete key and managed to get into the BIOS. I was fairly surprised at how many options were available with this being an off-the-shelf NAS appliance. All I did though was make sure that the boot priority was set to boot to a Ubuntu Live image just for testing, but I also found later that I needed to disable this setting here, which essentially just seems to override the BIOS settings and boot straight to the TOS bootloader. After all of that, booting into my live Ubuntu image worked just fine. Also, rather than disabling that setting in the BIOS, you can just remove the USB drive that has the TOS bootloader on it. To do that, you just remove 2 screws on the back, and then slide off the side cover. This is how you can add SSDs, upgrade the RAM, or as I mentioned, remove that flash drive with the TOS bootloader. Also, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with how these TerraMaster cases open up. On one hand, I love that you can just remove 2 screws to get to the SSDs and RAM, but I also sort of hate that it's the side of the case that slides off because, well, you lose 2 feet on the bottom so the case can't sit upright while you have it open. But that's a bit of a nitpick, so not that big of a deal. While I had the case open, I also removed the motherboard, which was just held in with 4 screws. The only thing that was really that interesting here was that the CPU doesn't have a fan. Rather, it just has a long heatsink that's cooled using air from the 120mm system fan. After screwing the motherboard back in, I dropped in 2 1TB SSDs, and also upgraded to just 16 gigs of RAM, as that's all I had on hand. Then I installed Proxmox with no issues, and set up everything as I normally would. With no hard drives plugged in and no VMs or containers running, the system idled at right around 15 watts, and adjusting the scaling governor and running the PowerTop auto-tune function didn't really make any difference here. Now 15 watts isn't incredible or anything, but it's still pretty solid. In fact, it's about half that of the ZemiQ Pro, which also uses the i5-1235U. I'm not going to go super deep into how well Proxmox worked because, well, I don't really need to. Everything worked just as you would expect it to. I didn't have any issues with virtual machines or LXC containers or PCIe pass-through, and I even got QuickSync transcoding working inside a Jellyfin LXC container. Oh, I guess I did have one weird issue when I was trying to pass through both of the SATA controllers to a TrueNAS VM. And yes, I did say both because, well, the system's a bit weird in that it uses the integrated SATA controller for 2 of the drive bays, and then a different AS media chip for the other 2 drive bays. When I first tried booting up that VM after passing through both controllers, it locked up. However, after restarting the system, it worked just fine, and I never experienced any other issues past that. In fact, that TrueNAS VM worked really well, and I saw very little performance overhead. The F4-424 Max can probably work really well as a little all-in-one server running something like Proxmox, primarily thanks to that i5-1235U. Speaking of which, I also ran Windows in Cinebench R23 just to get some rough CPU benchmark numbers. In Cinebench, it scored 6344 in the multi-threaded test and 1628 in the single-threaded test. And for some comparison, I grabbed a few other results. When comparing to the Ugreen DXP 4800 Plus, the F4-424 Max performs better in both tests. And while in the multi-threaded test it's only about as fast as this Lenovo system with an i7-8700, the single-threaded performance was better than just about anything else I've tested on this channel. Not that I necessarily test out a lot of high-end systems or anything. Power draw was also really solid, with the F4-424 Max pulling 15 watts at idle, and only jumping up to 37 watts when running Cinebench multi-threaded. I was a bit concerned about the lack of a CPU fan, but the CPU package temps never got above the low 80s. So with the CPU in this thing, plus the dual 10-gig NICs and the Gen 4x4 NVMe SSDs, you could pretty much run your entire home lab off this thing, although you'd probably want to upgrade the RAM. You could almost say it's surprising how well the system handled something like Proxmox, because according to TerraMaster, the F4-424 Max isn't compatible with third-party operating systems. Now clearly this works just fine, but I did want to point out that TerraMaster officially states that they won't provide support with third-party operating systems, and that it will invalidate your warranty. Now you can argue all day about whether or not they can actually do that, or how they would even confirm that you did run a third-party operating system, but I do think it's my job to let you guys know and decide whether or not you want to potentially have to deal with TerraMaster on that in the future. But what about their first-party operating system, TerraMaster OS, or TOS? Well, in the past I've sort of just dunked on it, and rightly so. It was a very rough experience, and there's no way I would even use it for just basic network storage. But that was a long time ago, and they've also just released TerraMaster OS 6, so I thought it was worth giving it a shot. Now, other than the fact that I accidentally failed to record a big chunk of it, the initial setup process was mostly pretty smooth. I just went to tnas.local, and then followed the steps to get everything set up. There was one hiccup early on where it asks you to select which drives you want to install the system to. It allows you to select up to 2 drives and recommended 2 of the hard drives, but I was thinking it would be smarter to install the operating system onto an SSD, so I opted for that. However, that ended up being a mistake that I'll talk about more here in a bit. There was also another small issue where it prompted to set up an admin email, but the verification email just kept failing to send. It almost seemed like they expected that to be potentially the case because there was an option to just skip it, and that's what I did. After that, it was time to set up my first storage pool. It recommended using T-RAID, which is TerraMaster's own RAID, which is essentially like RAID 5 and RAID 1, which is actually pretty cool because it allows you to use different capacity drives and expand a little bit easier, but I decided to just stick with RAID 10. With the pool and volume created, I set up a shared folder, which was actually really easy. And I love that this was all done from just within the Settings app. There wasn't like a storage manager app for the pools and volumes, and then you have to jump over to like a file manager to set up the share, but then jump back to settings to enable SMB. It was just all within the settings. SMB was already enabled by default, and I had a shared folder within just a couple of minutes. Now at this point, I was still just using a gigabit connection, so I also hooked up 10 gig, and setting up that interface was also really easy. Now, 10 gig with just the hard drives wasn't going to be that fast, so I also wanted to set up my SSDs for caching, but here's where I ran into some of my first real issues. First of all, I could only use one of my SSDs because I had selected the other one for the system drive, even though the root partition only took up like 8 gigabytes. Now, I guess this was partly my fault because I could have just selected the 2 drives that it recommended, and I would assume if you're using those hard drives for the system partitions, it would still let you use the rest of the drive for creating pools and volumes. But when I selected the SSD, there wasn't a warning or anything that would tell me that, well, that SSD was pretty much going to be rendered useless for anything else. And also, this is a bit of a side note, but I sort of wish they would have had 4 NVMe sockets, all of them at Gen 4 by 2, because then you could set up something like 2 SSDs and RAID 1 for your system, and then have 2 more SSDs for caching, and with Gen 4 by 4 you'd still have a lot of performance, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I still had my other SSD though, and with that I had the option to set it up either as a read-write cache, or in what they call balanced mode. That seemed to essentially be a read cache that could also sort of assist with writes, but not in a way that would potentially risk data loss. I selected the balanced mode or read cache, but that failed to work due to a memory issue error, which just didn't really make any sense. After a bit of digging, I decided to see if there was an operating system update, and sure enough, there was one, even though I had just installed the operating system using the online downloader, so not really sure about that. But after installing the update, the SSD cache worked, and performance over 10 gig was as good as you could really expect, at least when doing some simple file transfers. I also checked out the backup options in TOS, which seemed pretty basic but solid, with the ability to back up using rsync, to another TNAS device, or through a few different cloud services. Oh yeah, and this is a very small thing, but they have just a straight up terminal app. I really love that, and it actually came in handy a bit later on. For just basic NAS stuff, TOS6 seemed pretty solid. In a lot of ways, the UI was pretty intuitive and felt nice and snappy. That doesn't mean there weren't some quirks though, mostly in the form of some slightly amusing verbiage. For example, when setting up a share, it asked if I needed to set up quotas. But the options weren't yes or no like you might expect, they were confirm or cancel. Or my favorite was when I had just finished setting up a backup task. Not only did I get a tip window that was a question, but the question was, start the mission? Now, I don't really think that one's a bad thing. It kind of made using the NAS more fun. I felt cool. Start the mission. Yeah, let's start this backup mission. I think we should start using more terminology like that just to make things a little bit less mundane. Sorry, I'm dumb. Moving on. Another really quirky thing was the resource monitoring. It's really difficult to tell what you're even looking at and what the time range is, and also the update animation is just kind of horrible. But like I said, it was mostly just weird quirks with the UI or some of the language, nothing that was broken or unusable. It was mostly really rock solid, at least with the basics. Once you moved beyond that, well, it was back to feeling like TerraMaster. The first-party app library is pretty limited, but it does have a few tools that let you open up some more flexibility. For example, you can run VirtualBox for some virtual machines, and I was able to get a Debian VM running pretty painlessly. I did find it funny that the console viewer apparently relied on Adobe Flash, so yeah, this might be a bit outdated, but it also allowed you to download an RDP file so you could create a remote desktop connection. You can also run Docker either through their built-in Docker management app or using Portainer, which not only is a first-party app, but it actually sort of recommends it. I find this pretty funny because in my last video where I talked about a TerraMaster NAS, I complained a lot about how bad their Docker management was, and I wished that they would just include Portainer, so maybe they listened. I decided to start off with Portainer, and it was pretty seamless. It took me just a little bit to figure out the file paths for bind mounts, but after that I installed Home Assistant using a Portainer stack with no issues. Then I moved over to TerraMaster's Docker management tool and found that that's actually pretty solid as well. I was able to set up the exact same Home Assistant container without any issues. In fact, it was actually a bit easier because there's a nice UI for setting up those bind mounts. I also found it pretty cool that I could see within the Docker management tool that TerraMaster has the container that I set up within Portainer. And not only that, the Docker management tool has what they call projects, which I believe is basically like Docker Compose or Portainer stacks. And sure enough, I could actually even see the YAML config from my Portainer stack. Alongside the first-party apps, there's a tab for third-party community applications, which is really just this link to a website managed by what appears to be a single developer. And to be clear, I think it's really awesome that they have this and that there's someone this willing to create all these applications, and nothing I'm saying moving forward is anything negative about this individual. On that site, I found the Jellyfin app, which had dependencies for Modbase 1 and FFmpeg 51. So I downloaded all three, and for these you download the apps and then upload them to manually install them to your NAS. After installing all three and trying to run Jellyfin, I found that the FFmpeg 51 app actually has a dependency for the standard FFmpeg app, so I went to download that as well, and, well, I hit my download limit. To get around that limit, I either had to wait a few hours or pay $10 for a subscription. And, well, I was in a rush, so I hope the developer enjoys my $10. After getting Jellyfin running with all of the correct dependencies, I went to set up my libraries, but it seemed like the app didn't have proper permissions. And it took me a while to figure this out, because in TOS, you have users and user groups, but you also have what's called application users, and the Jellyfin user for this app was considered an application user. The problem is that you can set up permissions for shared folders from within the File Manager app or the Settings app, but within the File Manager app, you only have access to the dropdowns for users or user groups. For application users, you have to be in the Settings app, which took me a while to sort out. After getting permissions set up, I got Jellyfin up and running, and direct streaming worked just fine. However, I could not get hardware transcoding working for the life of me. I tried both the IHD and i965 drivers just to double check. I tried QuickSync and VA API, and I double checked the FFmpeg path, and nothing I tried could get it working. My guess is that maybe the F4-424 Max is a bit newer and isn't quite supported yet, or maybe I was just doing something dumb and completely missed something. I wanted to get Jellyfin running in TOS with hardware transcoding though, so I went back to Portainer and spun up the linuxserver.io image. With that, I also couldn't get my library set up due to some permissions errors, but that was a little bit more on me. When I set up my Portainer stack, I just used the default user ID of 1000, assuming that when I created my Haven user, it had the ID of 1000. However, my Haven user was actually the root user, so that had an ID of 0. So to fix that, I created a new user and made sure that user had read-write permissions for my media library. Then using the handy terminal app, I grabbed the IDs for that user and updated my stack in Portainer. After that, I had access to my media library, and since I also passed through the device at /dev/DRI, I was able to get hardware transcoding working. So it seems like third-party applications might be a little bit hit or miss, but it's nice that you can always just set things up yourself using either Portainer or the built-in Docker management tool. Just make sure to think through permissions. And lastly, since I was using a TerraMaster system, I had one more thing I wanted to try out. Why just have 4 drives when you can have 8? I've had this D8 hybrid DAS system lying around for a while, which gives you 4 more SATA hard drives, as well as 4 NVMEs, although with some limitations. And I was curious how something like this would pair with the 424 Max. So I hooked it up, dropped in 4 more 4TB drives, and okay, well, that was a bit lackluster. I was really hoping that this would at least recognize that I was using a TerraMaster brand DAS, but everything just showed up as standard USB drives, so not all that thrilling or that helpful. I did set up another 4-disk pool, this time using TRAID, and then also set up a backup task to simply back up a shared folder. After confirming the mission, it worked without issue. I think for adding storage for non-mission critical things like just backups or media libraries, adding a TerraMaster DAS could be a pretty solid option. It provides you some extra storage, and visually pairs pretty well with the NAS. However, it would have been helpful if they had some sort of visual that could show you which drives were in which slot, but oh well. There's still a lot more I could dive into with TOS, but that would make this video extremely long. Overall, it's definitely better than what I experienced in the past, especially with the basics. With the option to just run Portainer, this works really well for someone with a bit more experience. However, for someone that doesn't have experience and doesn't want to deal with Docker or VMs, well, the app solutions are a bit clunky. So while this might be a handy turnkey solution for simple network storage, it's definitely not that for hosting services. So overall, I'm not blown away by TOS, but am I blown away? Oh, I don't have a, it's missing a tooth. Overall, I am not blown away by TerraMaster OS, but am I blown away by the F4-424 Max? Well, no. In fact, I really don't even know what to think of this, especially with the $900 price tag. The dual 10 gig NICs are pretty awesome, but with only 4 drives, it seems like the networking is a bit overkill. And while having Gen 4 NVMe SSDs is nice, only having 2 of them seems a bit odd. For example, if you had 4, even at just 2 lanes each, that would still be a ton of bandwidth. I mean, theoretically, a single Gen 4 SSD at 2 lanes would have enough bandwidth to saturate both 10 gigabit interfaces. So I sort of just struggle to see exactly who this is for. If you don't need 10 gig and can get by with something like 2.5 gig, there are much cheaper options out there, especially if you're looking to install third-party software. For example, I looked at the system from AUStar recently, and for just around $400, you get very similar specs, but with a Ryzen CPU, 2 NVMe SSDs, plus an M.2 eKey slot, which you can also boot from using an adapter, and then dual 2.5 gigabit interfaces. Also, as much as I don't love the Ugreen DXP 4800 Plus, for a few reasons, it does have a 10 gig port plus a 2.5 gig port, comes with more RAM, and technically has 3 NVMe slots, although one is a bit tricky to get to. It also has a much better build quality and is substantially cheaper. I guess if you specifically need dual 10 gig NICs and also only need 4 drives and 2 SSDs, this might make a little bit more sense, but at $900, this seems like a pretty big ask considering some of the other options on the market. That being said, the more options there are in this market, the better, especially when they come with some pretty nice features like what this one has. What do you guys think though? Do you think this is a complete ripoff? A good value for a very niche buyer? Let me know down in the comments below, and maybe let TerraMaster know what you'd like to see from them in the future. That's all I have for this one though, so as always, thank you guys so much for watching, stay curious, and I really can't wait to see you in the next one.